Hello and welcome to Class 8 of Theory of World Politics. Today we're focusing on the concept of history and memory in the study of world politics. Please don't forget to also view the online content for this class as well as to complete the quiz with separate questions. I'm going to share the slides. Okay. Hopefully you can see it without problems. All right. So here is what we're going to cover today. We're going to first of all ask when and with what effects does the question of memory enter the scholarship of world politics? 2, what is the concept of social and collective memory as distinct from, for example, individual memory? And then we're going to lay out the so-called collectivist approach to study of memory politics, as well as bring some of the critical questions that emerge in response to it. We will follow this up with a final point of this introductory class or introductory presentation about actors and agents of historical wrongdoing or memory politics. Good. So let's start first with memory, category of memory entering the study of world politics, which is a relatively recent turn in the scholarship of international politics that complicates two assumptions that have underpinned international politics. The first one is that it focuses on the present. So where history is the study of the past, right? The study of international relations uses history as a context or backdrop to its inquiry, but really focuses on or tells the story of the now, the story of the present, right? And then the other complication is this sort of traditional assumption about international politics mapped onto certain temporality that's often called linear or sequential view of history, which is that history is basically a series of events that come in succession. So first, certain past, right? First, the more distant past, then the more recent events, then the present, and then some kind of future, right? So it might seem like really obvious or matter-of-fact statement, but in fact, it is a result of a more sort of sophisticated but very Western-centric view of time. And critical scholars working, for instance, in indigenous studies, critical indigenous studies, and studying indigenous people's worldviews have written extensively about alternative, different views of philosophies of history, for example, based on seasonal or circular view of time, in which past, present, and future do not follow one another like stages, but overlap in some kind of circular motion and are co-present. The important thing about the study of collective memory, right, is that in addition to having a kind of potential of complicating our relationship to the past as something that permeates our present moment, right, its interpretations exert particular impact on the present, make demands become objects of policy making, objects of controversy and politicization, but also perhaps claim making, right? It might be worthwhile now stopping. You could actually pause this video and do that, and asking yourself whether any historical event comes to your mind that fulfills this criteria. So a historical event that is inscribed in collective memory, an event that you know of, right? And that sort of fulfills all these criteria. So it shapes political positions, political attitudes, subjects, identities. It generates emotional responses and controversies. It is remembered through institutionalized means, so through public rituals, celebrations, perhaps, holidays, cultural texts, material culture like monuments, in oral history, and so on. And then finally, an additional kind of bonus is if you can think of an event that partly has this status of something that happened in the past that lingers or remained as a political event today, because it has a status of something, as I put on the slide, unresolved or not fully or adequately redressed. So an example perhaps of a wrongdoing from the past, right, that hasn't been sufficiently dealt with, or perhaps there is a view promoted by minority groups, by different social actors, that there is a need for redress, restitution, maybe an apology, right? Maybe a gathering of public knowledge, so truth commission, anything you like. So have a moment and think about whether anything comes to mind, either from your national history, from your familial history maybe, but also anything else that you might have read or are interested in. William Faulkner has issued made a well-known statement: "The past is never dead. It's not even past." This phrase has been picked up by many politicians, right, as part of many political speeches. The one that comes to mind for me is its use in Barack Obama's speech on race identity, a very famous speech that he gave as part of campaign in 2008. And it's a speech in which he tackled the question of race relations and racial inequalities and divisions in the US. Right? Obama said, "We do not need to recite the history of racial injustice in this country, but we do need to remind ourselves that so many of the disparities that exist today, right, I'm adding, between the African American community and the larger American community can be traced directly to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation." So you see here that statement is illustrative or suggestive of at least 2 points. The first one is that Obama is asserting here that there are very real material, but perhaps we could also add symbolic effects of historical wrongdoing. So differential law, right? He calls it the brutal legacy of slavery and segregationism of Jim Crow legislation. But another point of reflection that we could consider, I think, today is concerning those enormous difficulties and resistance, right, that a nation can experience in recognizing its own history that is some kind of injustice or wrongdoing, right, that casts into relief what I would call inglorious past. So it's, in other words, the contrast between this and an identity, national or group identity, that is shaped through remembering history of being a victim, right, of victimization, history of bravery, history of virtue, right? We could call it the glorious history, and as opposed to inglorious, when a group finds itself being an agent of injustice and perpetration. Now, in regard to world politics, the question that needs asking is how historical memory, questions of historical guilt, historical responsibility, enter the study of world politics, and how do they reconceptualize the key agency in world politics, agency of states, of course, but also beyond, of global actors. In regard to the state itself, what we've witnessed, well, the dating of it is somewhat controversial, but definitely since 1990s and perhaps even a little bit earlier, is a conception of a state that in addition to all of its other sort of functions and dynamics of operating in the international space as part of international order, becomes a bearer of historical responsibility, right? And a kind of platform for official remembrance. So memory becomes tied to the agency of to the global agency of the state. A paradigmatic example of such a state is, of course, post-World War II Germany, which through a series of juridical and quasi-juridical actions has embarked upon a course of redress to state and non-state actors for its actions during the Holocaust through compensations, reparations, apologies, truth and archival kind of historical research, and so on. This question also helps us, I think, show or discuss as a distinctive mode of action in world politics and of power, something I would call reparative global political events or reparative global political activities. So it might sound a little bit abstract, but I'm pretty sure you are familiar with quite a few of those. So, for example, official apologies that states issue to groups of victims, be it to other states or located outside of the state boundaries or within state boundaries. Scholars have said famously that we live in the era of apologies, and indeed, public apologies have proliferated, right? States saying sorry to those whom they have victimized in the past. Other examples of reparative political events and activities are, for example, tribunals and trials, international tribunals, such as the big tribunals from 1990s. One, International Tribunal for the Perpetration of War Crime in the ethnic kind of conflict of the Yugoslav state dissolution, and the other one in the context of the genocide in Rwanda. But since then, we have, of course, witnessed many more such cases because of the mandate of the ICC, International Criminal Court. A less formal series of reparative or example of political events are Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also different policies around financial reparations or compensations that states can either pay or undertake as a series of different infrastructural projects, for example, as part of its recognition of historical responsibility for wrongdoing. And then the final point I would want to mention here is that this shift also heralds emergence of a new subject in world politics, and that is that of victims of past crimes and crimes and dispossession. We could also say perpetrators, but I especially want to stress victims, because the legal and political international category of victimhood is something very unique and very novel post-World War II. Something of course, there were victims, but in terms of a formal status, right, and political legal status, this is really something unprecedented. So let me explain the concept of collective and social memory. It is important to qualify what does this preface social collective mean, because I'm sure we are all familiar with the term memory that functions basically as a kind of individual psychological faculty of the human mind, right? So the capacity that our minds have to retain, to store information, and to retrieve it as needed. Now, as a cultural, collective, and social phenomenon, memory, the way it's been theorized, starting from about 100 years ago in discipline of sociology, but of course beyond that since, means that it also makes sense. It's also important to talk about the way in which groups remember, in which they share and communicate memories within and across groups. So it could be a kind of a horizontal transmission, right, between different groups, but it can also be a transgenerational transmission, the way that memories are passed on through generations. Social and collective memory is also interested in how those memories, forms of remembrance, impact and imprint themselves on categories such as sociological categories such as identity, action, agency, right? Exertion of power or power dynamics, and so on. When we talk about social and collective memory, at the same time, we need to mention a kind of parallel phenomenon, and that is social and collective forgetting. And here it gets a little bit more complicated. Here I think this comparison to individual or psychological processes is a little bit trickier, because when we say forgetting, or I've forgotten, right? When we talk about forgetting in individual cases, we almost always mean something that isn't voluntary, something that isn't deliberate, a process that we sort of don't have control over, right? So, oh, I've forgotten. It doesn't mean I have deliberately not remembered. It happened to me more than I undertook forgetting. But when we talk about social and collective forgetting, we mean precisely this more deliberate, a form of activity, a form of political and social action that has to do with erasure and marginalization of certain historical narratives. So one of those I have already mentioned in the context of Barack Obama's speech on race, right? When I asked whether how do we understand controversies and the form of political and social resistance to a version of history that puts the collective in a problematic right, perhaps even forces us to recognize that there is some kind of wrongdoing has been perpetrated. I called it inglorious past. So this is one example of forgetting, basically marginalization. A version of forgetting is also, and here is a term that might be new to you, historical negationism, or a narrower rubric, denialism. Denialism, I find, is sometimes better known than negationism. And basically, it's a kind of a formal position of insistence that something did not take place, or if it took place, it was in a different way, different form, right, with different contents and detail than whatever version of history is being presented. Some countries have actually legislated against, so criminalized negationism. Again, Germany has criminalized historical negationism of some events, right? For example, Holocaust denial is a good example, well-known example of historical negationism. But other countries have taken a position of kind of embracing, perhaps even mandating historical negationism. And one example here that is given, for example, controversies surrounding Japanese history textbooks and how the Pacific War and Japan's military imperial expansion in Asia is interpreted, right? So the refusal to apologize by the Japanese state, for example, to victims of the Nanjing massacre, or refusal to apologize to victims of who were so-called comfort women, right? So, and sexual enslavement by the Japanese army. There were from Korea, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, basically the places where the Japanese army occupied. So I think it's important to remember that historical negationism, the states can take very different positions and there are different forms of it. There are also less obvious cases of historical forgetting that nonetheless I think are fascinating. I am giving here on your slides through this visual contrast. I'm not sure if that's quite visible. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of commemoration of World War I veterans, right? And then on the left-hand side, you can see 1918 Spanish flu memorial. To call it Spanish flu is perhaps an outdated and problematic terms, but let's just call it influenza pandemic that spread through the world in 1918, 1919, and that claimed more victims, right, than World War I. But if you compare how important has been the entrenchment of World War I in national memories in many states, European states, but also beyond, it contrasts very starkly with very little public awareness of the memory of influenza pandemic that basically coincided with it. Why this happened, I think that's not something I can go too much in depth here. I will just suggest, by referring to feminist discussions that compare those two cases, that what is interesting and important to remember is that the commemoration of World War I evolves around a use of a figure of a soldier or veteran as a kind of embodiment, right? An embodiment of idealized sacrifice of life on the battleground for the national good. Okay, so there is a kind of ideal of patriotism, loyalty, heroism in relation to a militant state, nation state, and that's contrasted with very different figures, right, that don't quite fit this heroic frame, and that is of the heroes of pandemic, which is doctors and nurses, right, and how do they fit within the sort of the way in which the state can use or co-opt, right, bodies of soldiers, representations of battlefield to inscribe ideologies of the nation state. That might be something to look more deeply into. So what is collectivist approach to memory politics? When we talk about collectivist approach to memory politics, this is basically the consideration that with the entrance that memory studies have made into the field of politics and international politics in particular, nation states have been recognized as having their agency transformed to be those sort of bearers of memory or responsibility or historical guilt, right? So the kind of recognition that nation states are the primary units of memory politics. This is how Hutchinson, for example, Emma Hutchinson, in her book Affective Communities, describes this collectivist approach, right? That forms of collective remembrance are irreducible to sum of the part. Now, the way that some discussions have problematized it, taking exactly this point of departure that claims, point of departure in the claim that the state is an actor of memory in global politics, is the primary nation state, is the primary platform of remembrance and the primary agent of dealing with and redressing historical wrongdoing. Okay. The first point here is that it does raise a question of the politics of decision of who will be recognized as a victim, who will be recognized as a bystander, right? And then also internal differentiations. So in regard to victims, the question who is going to be recognized as the given more, whose victimhood is going to be given more visibility, who is going to be recognized as a deserving victim, a victim deserving of apology or reparations or compensations, right? And who is going to be labeled as the undeserving victim, whose suffering is not given the same form of recognition. Related to this, to the questions around politicization of memory, that is, making historical memory into an object of policy discussions, of policy making, and of politicization of public controversies, is the question of the effects of making public memory events. Let me be more specific here. Think about truth and reconciliation commissions and the paradigmatic, the kind of first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in early 1990s in South Africa, right? A big question that emerged in the context of this forum was, who is going to be defined as the victim of apartheid, right? And for a variety of reasons, the design of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission applied a relatively narrow definition of a victim. It is someone who had to directly, on their own body, in their own life, directly experience the violence of state institutions like police. Okay, so there would need to have been a harm, physical harm. This meant that people who were, for example, related, right? So who were like, we would call them indirect victims, perhaps, were not recognized as victims at all. So if someone was a family member whose, I don't know, a child, a sibling, right, a partner was attacked and maybe killed by those institutions, they would not be recognized as a victim. They would be recognized as a witness or a bystander. So they had a very different case, different status, different standing in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But another problem is that the TRC in South Africa faced was that it has sort of become a spectacle of memory. So it condensed truth-telling, right? So documentation of truth, but also politics of reconciling former victims and perpetrators basically on TV, right? So scholars have pointed to problems of creating this big spectacle with political events and how it has produced what some people call a pressure to forgive and forget in that specific moment, right? And how negatively some of the victims responded to it. And then the final thing I will also mention, the problem with the collectivist approach to memory politics, is that it becomes susceptible to risks of commercialization, creating a kind of memory commodity, right? So this is exemplified by so-called genocide tourism. I have given you a little kind of icon there, which is a cover of a book, The Darker Side of Travel. And this is basically that kind of trend in which people travel as tourists to places of memory, to sites of memory where some horrific events like genocides or ethnic cleansing took place. There's also a Netflix documentary series, Dark Tourist, which you might see. I mean, it isn't very scholarly in its approach, but it is interesting in mapping this kind of international cultural phenomenon of what counts even as those dark sides that could attract people. Another perspective on the collectivist approach to memory politics is a juxtaposition between what is called competing remembrance and multidirectional remembrance. So let me explain this to you. This is linked closely to work or scholarship publication by an American memory studies scholar Michael Rothberg, who has written and coined this term, multidirectional remembrance. Competing remembrance, I think, is pretty recognizable. So I will describe it in a moment, and I'm quite sure that you would be able to give me examples, and perhaps even that historical example of which you have thought before as an example of memory politics would fit here. So competitive memory is basically historical narratives, especially of victimhood and victimization, but could also be memories of bravery and heroism that sort of crowd each other in the public space and compete, hence competitive, right? Remembrance, compete for attention, compete for visibility, and compete for status and recognition, right? So different kinds of what we could say, different sort of hierarchies of suffering, right? Michael Rothberg asks, what happens when different histories of extreme violence confront each other in the public sphere? Does the remembrance of one event erase others from view? Does memories of colonialism, occupation, slavery, and the Holocaust bump up against one another in contemporary multicultural societies? Must a competition of victims ensue? Right? And so the dominant view is that, yes, indeed, the competition of memory or competition of kind of historical status or recognition of history is a kind of a zero-sum game, right? So there will be some losers and there will be some winners. And I'm sure we could point out to poignant cases in today's politics in which that competition of suffering, competition of visibility and invisibility plays out very starkly. But Michael Rothberg suggests that, in fact, it is a non-zero-sum game when he talks about multidirectional remembrance. And he suggests that multidirectional memory, right? So the kind of imbrication or connections that form between different forms of remembrance that are not necessarily competitive. And he points us to three different levels. The first one is that historically, he said, these distinct group memories are not separable, right? This is a certain kind of imposition when we think about Holocaust studies, for example, right? It is a distinct historical event. There is a beginning and there is an end. There are different ways of demarcating it, up for debate what the beginning of the Holocaust is going to be, and perhaps less controversial when the end is going to be. But at the same time, it does link very closely with other forms of remembrance. So to point us to the current Israel-Palestine conflict, right? It's very hard to talk about this, the current events in a historical context without thinking about how these different forms of traumatic memory, politicization of memory, right, go hand in hand and imbricate with one another. Of course, they can be competitive, but there are other ways in which they also infuse, interact, and connect. So here I'm thinking about the memories of Nakba and memories of the Holocaust. Another level that Michael Rothberg recommends that we recognize is that rather than think about competition of different public remembrance, we could think about relations of kind of productive points of contact, right? How they productively feed into each other, he says. And so looking at specifically at the case of North America or US and Canada, Rothberg has argued that Holocaust remembrance has in fact led to politicization of other forms of memory. So other cases of historical wrongdoing that might not be historically related to the Holocaust, but there's been some kind of impact, right? So he talks about politicization of memory of slavery in the US, but also dispossession of the First Nations in what is now called US and Canada, and how the Holocaust studies did not, or at least not only competed with those, but in fact brought a certain impetus politically, socially, culturally within scholarship, right? And then the final point about multidirectional remembrance that's really important is that there is no, for Rothberg reminds us, a kind of automatic and singular translation between memories that we claim as our own and national identity, right? And this is because people carry multiple identities, right? There's a kind of irreducible plurality of social identities. And so each one of us can relate to definitely more than one national memory, or not national, but other than one group memory. And so the multidirectional remembrance is that at the level of identity, we have different forms of social and cultural relation to through identity to different history. Let me finish this off with the question of actors and historical wrongdoing, and this will also feed into a short introduction of the online material that's part of this class. So in the scholarship on, let's call it like the historical wrongdoing, public memory, genocide studies in world politics, up to a point, by which I mean 1990s, the focus had been mostly on the categories of victims and perpetrators in world politics. Raoul Hilberg, who was a Holocaust scholar, in 1990s published a very influential volume that suggested a different kind of taxonomy, and that is that in addition to victims and perpetrators, we also need to talk about the category of bystanders, right? So by bystanders, he basically means people, those who in all sorts of different ways kind of included people who impacted, but were also impacted by eruptions of mass violence, right? And so that was kind of like a watershed moment that really marked the beginning of scholarship on those different categories and taxonomies of world political actors in historical wrongdoing. So following Hilberg, another Holocaust scholar, Jan Gross, affirmed that the category of bystanders is very important, right? For historical research, for sociological research, for cultural research, but it's insufficient because it is so capacious that it will include numerically and qualitatively like a lot of different people. So he suggested that we should perhaps introduce a little bit more internal differentiation within that category. And Gross spoke about bystanders whom he classified as helpers or rescuers. This is also in the context of the Holocaust. And then beneficiaries, okay? One problem here with which Gross needed to kind of reckon with in his later years is that the historical complexity of cases like Holocaust is that you can actually have actors that straddle these categories, that inhabit dual subject positions. So in other words, you can have helpers, rescuers that are at the same time beneficiaries, right? And this is because structures of violence and structures of dispossession are complex, but also because, you know, if you want to take the model of East European populations that might have helped you know, rescue some of the Jewish populations during the Holocaust, like that's the paradigmatic historical case here, they could as well have been helpers and beneficiaries if, for example, they charged people whom they were protecting, whom they were helping, right? If they derived material gain. So we've got bystanders and those different categories within it. Following from Gross, and now beyond the Holocaust itself, there's been quite a lot of work on the category of the beneficiary. So Robert Meister, thinking specifically about cases like post-apartheid South Africa, so situations of historical justice or transitional justice, he sort of gave a lot of thought to the category of groups and individuals that derived some kind of advantage from the regime structurally. And this could have been material, but also social advantage, all right? And the big question of how the transitional justice system is set up, in Meister's critique, inadequately to deal with these categories, right? To recognize perhaps some kind of agency or culpability of beneficiaries that is completely unidentifiable within the formal international legal system. Bruce Robbins, his name is also on your slide, in a I think very important book that I recommend called The Beneficiary, writes a little bit more broadly. So beyond those cases of mass atrocity, for example, or genocides, he writes about structures and systems of well-being that are sort of contingent on events or phenomena of injustice and wrongdoing, often elsewhere. And this is really important, and this kind of is very provocative argument because it's placed outside of mass atrocity studies. So for Bruce Robbins, really many of us, if not most of us, think about yourselves listening to this introduction, are in some ways beneficiaries. And he asks about political consequences of recognizing or kind of identifying ourselves with benefits, right? With structures and systems and processes in which our current well-being is indebted to somebody else's position that could be precarious or unjust or involve forms of victimization and dispossession. It could be political, it could be commercial, it could definitely be global, right? So that's a perspective on the global south, global north inequalities, and so on. And then the final point that I would like to make, and this relates both to the readings you have for today and the online contents for Class 8, is the concept of implicated subject, which is the most recent of those. And it's another way of trying to rethink the category of the bystander. This is again done by the scholar whom I mentioned before, Michael Rothberg. And implicated subject for him includes beneficiaries, but is irreducible to them. So in a way, that's where Michael Rothberg comes in, is that there's something that a rubric of critical scholarship, right, that comes with this idea of a subject who is implicated in history, that for him exceeds questions of profit or well-being or benefit. Here is a quote from his book, The Implicated Subject, that we have in the library and that I recommend. Rothberg says that implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm, right? So that would be a perpetrator, direct agent of harm. They, so the implicated subjects, contribute to, inhabit, inherit, or benefit from, so there you go, there is benefit, but there is more than benefit, right? From regimes of domination, not necessarily only mass atrocity, but regimes of domination, structures of dominations. But they do not originate or control such regimes. That's really important. So what kind of question of what social responsibility arises if there is no formal relation of bringing those systems into existence or controlling them, which is to say being able to bring them to an end. I continue the quote. An implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather a participant in histories and social formations that generate the positions of victim and perpetrator, right? Is a participant in history that generate those positions rather than being one of those positions. This leads me to one of your texts for today is a text that Michael Rothberg co-authored on the concept of implicated subjects, right? And it has two case studies that he and his co-author that the text covers. One of those is a case that I would like to talk about that creatively invokes the category of implicated subjects to think about kind of global political activism, political memory activism. Okay. So this is a social media activist project, which you might be familiar with. It was called, it kind of belongs to the past. We Are Not Trayvon Martin, kind of a viral post or a blog. So just to give you the outline of it and introduce this case, is Trayvon Martin's case might be known to you. I mean, it is over 10 years old, the case, but it's basically a case of a death, killing of a 17-year-old African-American man or young man, right? Trayvon Martin in Florida, who was fatally shot by an American, a 20-something-year-old George Zimmerman, who claimed to have killed basically Martin in self-defense, but then in court he used a kind of a law that is quite old, which is called Stand Your Ground law, which legitimates a use of violence, a use of firearms, right? If you can document that you were protecting your land, your residence. So he successfully managed to use it in court. Now, after the arrest and charging of Zimmerman, and he's being acquitted by a jury trial of a second-degree murder in 2013, there was an enormous sort of wave of public attention and protests that followed that. And part of it was a project that was called We Are, or I Am Trayvon Martin. So there were all these walkouts by high school students, right? Who put hoodies on. I mean, that was one of the important elements that were kind of showcased in the trial, is that Martin was wearing a hoodie, so his face was unrecognizable. So those walkouts and those marches of protests started. They targeted the police. They also pointed out cases of like racialization of young men that puts them in the American context at the enormous risk of police violence, right? But it also spurred a curious critical reflection of who gets to hold that space? Like, who gets to hold a space of a subject position that can say, I am Trayvon Martin? Like, in some ways, we could say nobody can do that. Like, whoever is doing it has not been fatally shot, right? By someone who suspected their ulterior motives. But even young men who belong to African American populations, right, were kind of complicating this, but especially those who did not. And so this is where there's a resonance between a particular activist project that ensued and the idea of an implicated subject who, investigates or looks closely, critically at the structures and the system of inequality and privilege from the perspective of their own participation, or exactly implication, that of being folded onto it, a system they didn't originate, they don't directly control, a system they are against, right? And they want to express their solidarity, but they also don't want to problematically appropriate a subject position that does not belong to them by matter of age, gender, race, of course, right? And never will. So I encourage you to look at this project. So basically follow the link to We Are Not, Trayvon Martin, and look closely at the discourse and language that people use. So what do they state? What position they take? What are they against? But also, how do they state from the very beginning, right? From the get-go, what their subject position is and isn't, rather than obfuscate that kind of connection. Good. So this brings me to the end of the lecture. So I'm going to leave you with that. Again, a reminder to please read the text for today, look at the online content, and then when you feel ready, go and fill the exam, the quiz that is for class 8. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.